all of these emotions, all of them, they're all necessary. And I just want to welcome all of them so that we can kind of see that spectrum and say, okay, I'm welcoming this emotion that might be more like challenging, but I need to feel some fear sometimes. It can be very helpful. Or when I do feel that, what divination, what is the divine in that moment of fear or that moment of compassion? What is it sharing with me? What is that message sharing with me in that moment?
Welcome to the Mindful Rebel podcast, your refuge for personal growth. We're all on a journey to reconnect and nurture the most authentic parts of ourselves. And in this podcast, we explore how these modern day rebels are using mindfulness to transform themselves and the world around them. Each episode will dive deep into personal interviews with social impact healers, teachers, creatives, and leaders. Through their stories and insights, you'll engage with powerful teachings to spark your mind, prompts to ignite your reflection, and techniques to integrate wisdom into your daily lives. Make sure you like, subscribe, review, and share this podcast while joining us at the intersection of mindfulness and social change that challenges the status quo, awakens our collective wisdom, and creates a world with peace, clarity, and freedom. All right. Welcome to the Mindful Rebel podcast. My name is Sean. I know it's been a minute since there have been new episodes, but if I was going to start recording new episodes, I would not want to do that with anyone else besides one of my favorite people on this earth. Chanti, welcome back to the podcast, I can say. Yeah, I had to go back and look, and I was like, okay, we get a chance to talk, but in terms of like a recorded conversation, that was back in like late 2020. So welcome back. Almost over about 4 years later. Welcome back.
Been that long.
It's been a minute.
Yeah. Not since we've talked, but
not since we talked though, but since there's a recording of the talk. But a lot has changed since then. Dr. Chanti, a lot has changed since then. How are you? I guess as we sort of catch up or allow the audience to get caught up, what's happened since 2020 to now for you? Like, how are you showing up in the world? How are things flowing for you?
That's a loaded potato question.
I figured.
Well, I feel like there was a lot happening in the world. There's still a lot happening in the world. In terms of, I guess, the biggest thing, I'm going to say the biggest transition that I have made is I am now a doctor, and thank you for calling me that. It feels a little bit like, ooh. And actually this project and this process really came out of that whole, I don't even know what to call it. Like, I feel like I'm still in the midst of like this portal of like creativity that's not necessarily forced, but there's a kind of time frame on it or a timeline. You have a certain amount of time to complete this project or process. If you don't want to pay extra, I should say. I didn't want to pay anything extra. So there was like, there is a timeline for holding this space for a specific creative question, to answer that creative question, or to answer that question for me creatively. And so that has been, I feel like, the biggest thing. I think in 2020, I had just around that time, I had been accepted to complete my, doctoral studies, and now it is finalized and complete. And I feel like I'm at the place of like, I'm at the cave's edge where your eyes are still adjusting to the sunlight and you're not quite sure, like, is it safe to come out of here? And you're like, well, let me just test drive it a little bit. And then you might like lean a little bit back and like cover your eyes and be like, okay. And I feel like so I completed it in the winter time, and now it's the spring. So hopefully I'll be ready to like fly out.
That's cool. I know you mentioned just this idea of like a question, a creative question that you've been sitting with, and you're thinking about the completion of your research and your project and your work. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about your work in your program and for your dissertation?
Yeah, so it's a Jungian depth psychological and archetypal studies program. And the question that kind of was birthed through practice and dreams and yoga nidra and resting and walking, the question that came from that was, what is the image of the wound? And when I use the word image, I use it loosely, not necessarily just as like a printed picture or a drawing or a photograph, but an image can be anything that expands and kind of draws from the imagination, or is imagined, is sung, is moved, is cooked. You know, an image can be many different things. And so that was the kind of central question. And then in a dissertation, you aim to answer it. And that's what I did. I aimed to answer that for myself, and also to create something that we can all answer that question, because wounding is something that it's difficult to talk about. It brings up a lot of like hard feelings and things that we want to just like push under the rug. And at the same time, it can be, I should say, at least it was for me, it was very medicinal to look at it and to not only kind of quote unquote answer it, but like live with it and be with it. And for me particularly, I was looking at the wound of homelandlessness. So of being from another place and another culture and literally another country, family-wise, and then being born in the North American soil. So that was a kind of wound that I looked at and said, what is this image? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What might it taste like? Where is it leading me? What is its medicine? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A question I would ask you is, based on like your research and your work, and just based on like your own experience, like how did you approach defining wound?
Yeah, that's a great, great question. So wound for me is in French, I might get this kind of wrong, but in French, the word is blessure or blessé, that actually means like a cut, like a wound that, your body, if you like scrape you fall and you cut yourself, you're like, oh, I cut myself. And then I started to think about that word, and I remember being on retreat with Michael Mead, and he has these like really great rituals in the beginning of all his retreats, and you kind of go into a space and you look at different altars that are related to the elements. And sometimes you just pick like either a paper or a poem. And this time I literally have it right very close to me. This time it was like a piece of wood. And on the piece of wood, it said blessing. And then during the retreat, you sit in a table with that word so that you meet new people. And the first kind of sitting was looking at that word. Actually, it was blessure. I'm looking at it, which means cut in French. And we were looking at the word and kind of just discussing it. What does it mean? And when we look at it in English or written in English, it has bless in it, right? And somebody in the table was like, oh yeah, it reminds me of saying, like in the South, people say, bless your heart, And so we came across this word like blessure and looking at it and feeling into it. And then I remember him coming by and he said, this word in French literally means wounding, to wound. And I've done some research on that. There are very little etymological threads that actually point to that, but it wasn't that important. So I started to feel into what that wound was for me, and to also see not only the pain and the longing of like, oh, I'm not from here. And I literally tried to go back to like my homeland, my motherland, fatherland. And it was like, no, you're not from there. You're not from here either. And then to grapple with that and to live with that of like, oh, this is who I am, right? I'm blessed to be who I am of two places or many places, more than that. But in my experience, it was like my whole childhood was about, oh, you would go, I was born in Miami, so I would go to like the water's edge, and my grandmother would say, oh, that's our real home, and point across the ocean. And I was a small child, or that's what I remember from it. So I look at the wound as the residue of something that happens to one, right? Not necessarily the event, the traumatic event, or like the fall. If you fall, I'm not looking at the actual fall or the actual cut, but when we fall or when we're cut or when we're wounded, there's something that stays with us that I can't get rid of. Me personally, I can't get rid of being born on this side of the, waters. I can't get rid of that with the longing of wanting to be from another place. And I just saw a lot of uh, wanting to honor that as a wounding and as a blessing and as a residue, and then to see what medicinal qualities that can have for me, and in general for us who, I mean, I feel everybody has some kind of wound, whether it's a baby wound, a medium wound, a grand wound, an ancestral wound. And they might kind of mix and commingle. And so, yeah, that's the wounding is the residue that can have both the sensations and the feelings of like pain and sadness and regret, and also of like wonder and awe and possibility.
Mm. Yeah, my mind is going, and I appreciate you sharing that. I know for a long time I had, just in our conversations, and I had that wounding sort of written. I have a dry erase board over here that I sort of write things that I'm sitting with on, and that came up quite often for me. I guess I would ask you, as you think about like exploring this definition of like wounding and really sort of coming to the space of realizing that like it's something that will be with us, and there is something beautiful in it, there's something healing in it, there's something that we can, like, there's wisdom in it that we can extract from it. Why do you feel like a lot of folk, we try to get past that or act like the wound isn't there, or we like, what is in that sort of makes us not want to explore that, right? Because I was thinking, ever since contextually you've talked to me about your research, I've really been sitting, I'm like, how often do we try to like suppress it or act like it didn't happen, or act like, cool, the incident happened and I'm going to just try to extract anything else from that, and that just never existed. But in reality, we think about wounds and like there's often a scar that's left, right? And there's something still left as a reminder for us. But why do we sometimes act like it's not there?
Well, I think first of all, I think we might act like it's not there because that's a way to remain safe. That can be like the first level of like, okay, we can feel safe if we forget, and then we might remember later on, and then we're just kind of used to putting it away because it takes up time and space. And I will just say, I really feel like this overculture of like, go fast, go hard, make money, be successful, um, gets in the way. It gets in the way. It's almost, I think of it as a compost pile. So like when we have, the banana peel or whatever that is, we just throw it away in the trash, like in the literal tin can that, or I would say not everybody does that, but like, you know, I didn't have a compost growing up, and my city didn't have like a little bin for the compost. And so we want to get rid of things that are kind of in the way. And pain and wounding can kind of get in the way of taking care of our family, doing the job that needs to be done. Um, and I also feel like because, and I don't know exactly where that comes from, that's not something that I think it might be different depending on the wound itself. Um, but I'll use general terms that the overculture doesn't want us to, they want to keep us working and striving, you know, and maybe if, you know, we came in contact with something that was more meaningful, then we would strive for something that was perhaps different than what overculture, I'm using that big word, right? Or, you know, like general saying like, oh, we're going to keep you tired, busy, reaching, goal-oriented, and like that goal-oriented of like being like the best, you know, the most successful, rather than saying, well, what's enough? What's enough for me? You know, what is success mean for me? And in my own experience, living with that, with the image of the wound, and I use pictures, I use picture, movement, and I wouldn't call it a song, but like a phrase or just some humming that I do. In those three, when you keep that kind of present and alive, um, for me, it's kept, it keeps me in a place, and it allows me to expand from my own wisdom rather than having to follow, you know, I don't know, the wisdom that we get like on Instagram, like, ooh, that's what you, your life should look like this. Um, versus like, oh, I'm gonna look, I have on this side, I have this big, huge image of like a being, and in it, I've drawn and written. And sometimes I sit in front of it, and I get direct wisdom from it. You know, when I have like um, a thought of, I don't feel enough, you know, or I don't know how to like navigate this situation. Um, and that wounding, because it's so present, or I would say the wound is so present, and I can't change that. I can feel a sense of home and a sense of home place, um, but like being born and having to and saying like I'm my feet were born on this land. I could never say that. You know, I can't prove that. And sometimes this idea of having to prove oneself, um, it gets in the way. And so I sit in front of that image, and it usually reminds me, you don't really have to prove yourself, you know.
Mm. Yeah, that's a I appreciate you sharing that, because you know I feel like you're talking directly to me with this idea of like sort of sitting with it and sort of reminding yourself in terms of like, how is that showing up for you? Is that showing up for you in terms of like you need to move in a performative way, and that you got to be the best and you got to do the things, and realizing, to your point, like that's that's that overculture that's forcing us to do those things. And I guess when, you know, as I think back to like the practices that have been helpful for me, I think about all the stillness practices that have really allowed like things to settle. Like I don't know why I always think about in practices where it feels like it's like agitated water, and in that like there's, it's hard to actually see in it, but like in stillness everything gets a chance to settle, and there's much more clarity. And to your point, connecting to and with that wisdom that's available in that wound. One of the things I'll ask, like, do you have any thoughts or perspectives on how to like explore the feelings that come up when sort of sitting with the wound?
Yes. I do. First of all, I want to say that the exploration of feelings and our emotions, um, we, they come from like a learned place. Yeah. So when we use that word feeling, and whatever feeling comes up, the first kind of look at it, the first glance, you might say, almost like, when you look at like a color palette and you take a first glance at it and you're like, well, that's red, and then as you get closer to it and you start to adjust your eyes, or as the light changes in the environment that you're in, you might say that, oh, that's like maroon, or that might be like a red fire orange. Or you might shift it and be like, that's a cadmium, you know, uh, red. And so I say that because red is kind of, that's just how we generalize it, with any feeling. Like if we have a feeling of like um, pain or sadness, and usually it's, I shouldn't say usually, even joy. Joy can be one of those difficult feelings to sit with because we might not know what that is, or we've seen it, but we haven't experienced it in that way. And so kind of like base level is to begin to adjust our personal, I'm going to use the word definition loosely. When I think of a definition, it always, it can change, I will say. So we first is to really begin to define and to look at that coloring. I can use the word color, like look at that red from, at like when the sunrise starts to come up, right? That's going to be different than when the sun is completely out, when that red color is completely, like you can see it perfectly. And then, if you experience that same color in a dimmer, dusk environment, it's going to change. And so when we approach the feeling, especially when in relationship to this idea of wound, we want to start, not necessarily, we can't start with this idea of like a clean slate, this word tabula rasa. Like we don't come in empty. We don't come in like, you buy a new sketchbook and it's like empty at first glance, but then you start to look at it and the paper has a certain grain and a certain field. And, if you, depending on the pen you use, it has a different field. And so we don't come in empty. So I don't want to say like, just suppress what you've learned, but, because the reality is that, if I talk about, if towards that wound, I'm like pissed, I'm like furious at it, I can't just erase that and say, well, I'm going to approach this wound empty. That might be interesting, but it might not be totally and completely true. And so you think about it as like different perspectives, or you feel into that feeling from a spectral point of view, versus this is what I know. And words, I will say, words, especially when we're talking about feelings, and even sometimes when we're talking about wounds, they're very big, they're very powerful. And so I wouldn't start off with like the biggest wound. Even my path towards developing this research question about wounds, it was a long time coming. It wasn't like, although, academia would love it, they were like, just come up with a research question. And I'm like, whoa, how do you do that? Like, I can't do that. And so even my approach to it was very slow. It's like the compost again. It's a slow process, or like a slow cooker, or anything that takes a really long time. And so you might approach a feeling that is, kind of neutral, or you're just kind of curious about, I mean, it can take you any direction, to be honest. Any feeling can take you. But maybe one that doesn't a feeling that doesn't have so much charge to it, I would say. And then explore it in that like spectral view. Or forget about the feeling, just take a color, right? So take a color from your, I don't know, people have like, I have a whole bunch of like groupings of colors, markers or colored pencils, or you can like, anything, fruits, just look at the fruit color and literally look at it in the morning, when the sun is coming up and be like, oh, and then look at it like when the sun is brightest, and then look at it like before you go to bed and notice how that same color changes. And then then explore a feeling that has very little charge, like compassion. I picked some cards before we met, like compassion, and be like, oh, how can I relate, or how can I muse about or think about or be curious about compassion in the morning? And then you might be driving around town and somebody like cuts you off, and you might pause there and be like, oh man, this is a little bit more difficult for me to explore compassion for this person just, cut me off. And then explore that same feeling at a different time of day with curiosity. I will say, like, curiosity was a real big anchor, and an anchor, and at the same time, like, um, whenever I want to call in my dog when he's outside, I say cheese. I don't want to say it too loud because then he'll come into the room, and that gets his attention, right? So curiosity gets my attention, and it really like pulls me in different directions. And so I would say approach the feeling, approach the color, even approach the wound with like curiosity. It's not necessarily neutral, but it can go in so many directions. You can be curious about what a path looks like and just step with one foot and be like, nah, not that curious.
Listen, thank you for sharing. And it's funny, for those that are listening to the audio, we're definitely pulling up cards, but I literally pulled a card this morning and I was like, oh, this just makes total sense. Let me sit with this.
Oh,
But for the folks that are curious, can you talk a little bit about your Birdsong Somatic Circle deck, Oracle deck, excuse me. Tell me a little bit about this beautiful deck that you got here.
yeah, well, so I'm really glad you asked me about like my research and my dissertation and all of that, because just prior to that, I had a series of dreams, and I started a series of drawings. And as I was working on my dissertation, I saw two dissertations really. I thought my the program that was in wouldn't let me do what I really wanted to do, so I began to see two things happening. And then what happened was that this birdsong oracle actually it helped me drawing all of these and exploring all of these feelings from that kind of curious perspective, because when I did go into the wounding, it wasn't so foreign, or I wasn't so activated by, the sadness and the grief and the pain and the loss of what the dissertation was sharing and showing with me, not only my own, but the pain and the grief and the loss of like my ancestors. And when I was making this deck, and this was also coming for, we talked last time, 2020, this was the same time that I was first starting my research, and it was also kind of the time that we were isolated and in our homes, and our movement in our bodies were, for some of us, we lay around and love the being home and tending to our needs and ourself in a different way. And for a lot of the whole world, that was very new. And the way that we moved in our spaces became very different. And for me, it became almost medicinal. I'm going to use the word medicinal to move differently. I was somebody who worked at home, and at some point it was like outside was safe, and other times it was like outside wasn't safe. There were places that like the beaches were closed and the parks were closed. And so I started to, and this had already happened, but the way that I started to connect with these different feelings became very embodied, very somatic. And even the research question, I would literally move my body in different ways. I would roll on the ground sometimes. Other times I would mimic, these different birds that were kind of coming in a lot of different ways. I would mimic what I knew about them. Some birds, like I have a really, and for those of us who are listening and don't have the oracle in front, the oracle is mainly the upper body of a bird and then the humanoid shape and the lower body. And so I started to mimic these different kind of birds and what I knew about them. And then I would lay down and rest. And so when I would lay down and rest, actually in both places, sometimes when I would move, there is an intelligence in our body that shares wisdom. This, again, sometimes it has to be slower, and the overculture doesn't want us to be like, oh, all I had to do was like move my body and feel into like either the pleasure or the tension or the tightness or the fluidity of the body, and glean some kind of either curiosity or some kind of ancestral pain or some kind of complete full joy from our bodies. And then I would lay down and then I guess rest. I would just rest. And that combination helped me to understand these feelings from a more spectral place. Yeah. So when I would move with these different shapes, and really it's just a shape. It's a shape that the body takes. And in an exercise, wellness, even like yoga moves, yoga asana, there are specific shapes. But what happens when we take on the shape of like a tree or the ground, and some yoga asanas, like most folks know like downward dog. But what about like dog in the river, or tree blowing in the winds, and some other, practices of moving the body. We begin with a shape, and then we allow it to kind of take us on a journey. And so I feel like I don't feel like I ever create things. I feel like they ask me, hey, can you help me come into the world, please? And so I feel like it came through really to explore what those feelings are in an embodied way with our bodies, with our shape, with kind of mimicry of something that is happening in the natural world, which is both our bodies, the shapes that it takes, and in this case, the birds that and the birds, they live in all dimensions, right? Some birds like fly for years up in the skies, only coming down very little. And then, there are birds that kind of hover on the tree lines or the mountains even higher. And then there are birds that live like on the ground, and they don't necessarily like to fly or want to fly, but maybe they can hop a little bit. And then there are birds that live underground and even swim and go deep into the water. So this is like, thinking of the movement of what a bird does, and the movement that our soma, our body, can take on to inform us, was really kind of wanting to be shared in this way. That's why it's a somatic oracle. And then I didn't want to create something that, again, I was sharing more of my definitions with, but rather I wanted to have the person who was playing with this deck to begin to craft their own definitions of what those feelings are, because I don't necessarily, I mean, has anybody ever asked you, like, hey, how do you experience connection, or how do you experience like grief?
No, and you know what? It's one of the interesting pieces since I've been able to explore with it. I actually, it's made me sit and try to define that, right? Because I feel like so often we, especially I think about social media, like we see these words used all the time, right? It's like, yes, we're looking for connection. Well, what does connection mean? It's like, yes, we're creating space to explore grief, but like, what does that actually mean, right? Like, I feel like so often there are so many feelings that, or emotions that we are encouraged to work with in some sort of way. But it's like, well, are we actually talking about the same thing, right? Like, what does inspiration mean to you, right? And so I actually really enjoyed the idea that, like, even in the guide, I was like, oh, it actually isn't a definition of what that means. So, let me think about how do I connect with the word inspired? What does that mean? What comes up for me in that? So I think there's something really beautiful about that, about creating space or that inquiry to sort of be curious around, well, what does this actually mean to me?
Yeah. And you know, I feel like part of my purpose and, you know, service on this earth is to create more spaces for people to get creative. And so that could either, it could go either way, you know. It could go like, oh no, I don't necessarily want to make anything. I just want to be told what this is. And so, and at least for me, that was kind of my push against this overculture, that, and I love guidebooks. You know, I love books. I love to read slowly. But sometimes in a lot of my books, I have a lot of question marks. Like, really? I'm curious about that. Or like when I underline in my books, I'm like, I allow myself to like daydream and kind of go off and feel into that. And so I wanted to create that space for all of us to wonder and have the ability to change and to shift and to say, well, inspiration means today, this is how I'm feeling it. Tomorrow, you know, I might have like some delicious tea with a good friend, and that inspiration takes on a different image. And so I really did not want to add to the overculture of telling you how to feel or like defining it to, and I did a lot of research on emotions. Like everybody has a system, and they're great. You know, we were talking earlier, like a system can help us organize our thoughts, it can help us organize our life. And so I wanted to create just enough, but then have some space for us to like be invited into creativity and be invited into curiosity and be invited into letting those definitions be loose, and either writing or drawing or coloring, and then saying, oh, this doesn't work for me anymore. And you know, in my imagination, um, people would like collage over in this guidebook. They'd be like scratch away or like paint it. I know that may or may not happen, but like, and to create a palimpsest, you know, so something that is layered upon layered upon layered, because it's true, you know, if we look back at any roots of like words, you're like, oh my gosh, you know, this word came from here, and then, you know, society uses it in a different way. And, you know, there's some words that like young people are using today. I'm like, I don't know what that means. You know?
I get you. That's actually one of the reasons why there's a part of me that misses working out of college because I felt like it kept me young, where I'm like, well, what is that? Like I could directly ask my students, I'm like, I heard you say this. What does this actually mean? Because I've never heard it used like this before.
Yeah. Yeah. So it happens naturally, but then in like reverse, when somebody says, oh, that's so this actually happened. I don't remember the word that this person used, but oh, like you're breaking the mold. And I was like, not really. Like, and that's like usually like a positive thing, right? Like you're breaking the mold. Like people say that to say like a positive thing. But when I really sat with it, and at this point, I was sitting with a lot of these, like, and I had to define my terms all the time. If there's anything that I learned, a really important lesson that I learned from one of the professors, Dr. Susan Rowland, she said, define your terms so people know what you're talking about. And I think it's a really important offering, because when I say break the mold, I'm like, I don't want to necessarily have to, first of all, I'm not breaking any molds, because some of those molds, and we were talking about the overculture, it's like, no. But I actually, maybe we don't have to break something that's already so hard. Maybe it's like, let's just create something different or dream up something like alternative rather than push against the same heavy rock. And, there are people who are made and put on this earth to push against those heavy rocks. And then, there are other folks that are like, oh, but I'm just going to create this really soft nest instead over here. That's me. So it is really, it feels like a really important uh, invitation and welcoming to make more space for all of us rather than add to the word soup.
And I appreciate, there's a few things you shared that I appreciate you naming. And I won't lie, like my initial opening of the guidebook, where it's like I pulled a card and then I was like, cool, fearful, okay, what page is that on in the guidebook? And I was flipped, I was like, oh no, okay, and in that there was like a beautiful tension around discomfort because it's not handed to me, but then also let's get curious around what does it really mean, right? And I appreciate that space, to your point, naming that level of spaciousness, that like, actually there's spaciousness, there's a little bit of a challenge for us to explore that ourselves, right?
Absolutely.
Especially in a place where I feel like so often we're inundated with other people's ideas, right? Like we think about the news, we think about podcasts, we think about videos on YouTube, like everywhere, books. We're often really, really just inundated with the way other people's perspectives are on things. And I enjoyed the ability to sit back and say, well, I'm sure I could Google a definition to fearful, but what do I think about that? Right.
Yeah.
And I love that. And I want to name, thank you for naming the fact that that can change moment to moment, right? To your point, like fearful can look like this today. It can look different in a month, and it can definitely look different in 2 years, or it could look different 5 years ago, right? And so that idea that there's a fluidity to our feelings also, I feel like, is a beautiful thing to name.
Yeah. I feel like what you're sharing is, it's very binary, right? Like you have a card deck, you have a guidebook. The guidebook is going to tell you what to do. There's you have a Google, you can write in it and define and get the definition. And that binary feels very painful to me, going back to this idea of being of two places. It's very painful. It's like you're not from here and you're not from there. And so making that spaciousness, not only does it slow us down, it slows us down because we're invited to do something. And we also forget that we are a collection of everything we've experienced, so we are like a big collage, whether we know it or not. Even when we look at the guidebook, how we read that, it's coming from this lens that is a collage of things. And so And that's great. And to slow us down and to make us not necessarily, I mean, maybe, yeah, you said it was uncomfortable, and it is having to change our perception of the world from being this or that, and to be in that tension of like, oh, it can be so many things. It is often uncomfortable. It is, because it might feel safer or easier to just say, pick. I feel like there was a study done once around jelly, like jelly from, and I may be completely getting this wrong, but I feel like I read this or heard about it a long time ago. But if you had like two options, you're more liable to like make a purchase. You look at one or you look at the other. But if you had many options, it's like an overwhelm. It's like, what do I choose? And so you're maybe more liable not to choose at all. And so being in that space where there's so many varieties, and here's the part that I feel like I want people to get in tune with is, well, what am I intuitively attracted to right now? And trusting that, and taking home the jelly jar and being like, oh, this is a really cool taste. Or like, oh, this is not. And so rather than be and overwhelm, it's a big feeling too, to have too much, too expansive. But we're kind of in that soup. Like you said, social media is a lot. What do we do with that? If we don't put out like a information, we're like, something's wrong with us. If you've ever had like a friend that puts a lot of stuff on social media and then they stop posting, you're like, what happened? you know and so that it can be uncomfortable to but then you think of you, if you ever had those choose your own adventure processes, like
I
that's
used to love those books growing up.
it's like, okay, let's choose our own adventure. Let's dream a little bit. And it gets us moving in a slower pace and in tune with who we are in our community. And then we can expand out more too. Like sometimes we just need to be like, oh, who am I? What do I feel about fearfulness? And if we have a dog, we both have dogs. So like, if the dog stops and they look scared, you stop with the dog. Fear is a excellent emotion. We can't just put that to the side, and then what happens? The dog like sniffs around, looks around, reorients in their space, and you're like, okay, it's safe enough. Maybe I'll continue. And they may stop again because they hear the same thing again. So it's and these and I really feel for the emotions themselves that have been like, this emotion is non-acceptable. This emotion is the only one that's acceptable. This emotion is the one that I want you to show up like this and only like this, please. I don't want to have to deal with all this other stuff either. And to me, that's kind of sad to the emotion, because I feel like all the emotions, I actually wonder sometimes when people say, in my life, people have said, oh, that you're so emotional. And it's like, well, everything is an emotion. Can you imagine if you just like deleted all emotion, completely? What would you have? There would be like no context. And if you were without any pain, like any physical pain, you die. Like that is a researched, I can't remember it again, but like if you can't feel literal pain in your body, you can have like a wound or a break and not know it. Literally. I mean, there are people, there's a term for that. And you have to wear, like, usually they don't last that long because something happens to them and they don't feel the pain that says to the parent, ouch, I'm hurt. And then the parent go looking and researching and taking them to like emergency. So all of these emotions, all of them, they're all necessary. And I just want to welcome all of them so that we can kind of see that spectrum and say, okay, I'm welcoming this emotion that might be more like challenging, but I need to feel some fear sometimes. It can be very helpful. Or when I do feel that, what divination, what is the divine in that moment of fear or that moment of compassion? What is it sharing with me? What is that message sharing with me in that moment?
Thank you for naming that. One of the things that I say often, and I forgot, I picked it up in some of my Buddhist circles, and I know this comes up in Buddhist philosophy, this idea that like we typically label things like good or bad, but what would it feel like, especially when it comes to feelings, where we're like, that's a good feeling, that's a bad feeling, but what would it be like to sort of flip that and say, like, is this feeling skillful or unskillful in the moment, right? Because it's like anger actually is very helpful. Is it
It
skillful
is.
in this moment in which you're in? If it's not, how can you explore that, right? Or, and there's certain instances where being happy might be unskillful in the moment, right? But it's sort of changing our relationship and our dynamic around, like, is something good or bad, right? Because when we put it on, those two ends of the spectrum, then there's this real, like, to your point, like binary choice of like, well, I don't want the bad thing, so let me push that away. And I only want the good thing, so let me pull that in, versus the emotion being what it is, or the feeling being what it is, and creating space to interrogate, how is this showing up for me in the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. And even sometimes, we might look at something that's for our eyes seems joyful and happy, but it might be like some kind of nervousness that somebody has. There's a lot of like laughing at funerals, and some people laugh at funerals because they're telling stories, and then other people laugh because there's it's like a nervousness in it. And then we might say, oh, that's bad or that's good, without context and without grace and without letting that emotion be what it is, because we might need the laugh at the funeral. At least in Cuban culture, there's a lot of stories and a lot of laughing at funerals, and it's kind of what gets us through. Yeah.
Thanks for sure. There's a question I have for you. Like, when I think about like the parallel birthings of like the Birdsong deck
Mhm.
and your research, was there anything that was revealed to you about your creative process that, it made you maybe look at it differently, approach it, reaffirm anything around that as you were working on really two big, things to birth into the world, right? Like two really big statements to sort of bring into, manifest.
Yes, that I haven't thought about it like in that kind of question. Um, but I did struggle at some point thinking about like, I'm using that word in quotes, I should be putting all of my attention to this big thing that's financially burdensome and is gonna like give me, I still don't have an actual diploma, so I'm not even looking for it, but that it's supposedly giving me something. So shouldn't I be putting all of my attention to that and like having it be like hard and difficult? And people say that they are like, oh wow, you did such a hard and difficult thing. And it was very clear to me that I just can't work that way. But sometimes I would spend time with the bird song, and I would draw and paint, and I actually took out a chapter, um, thinking that they had to belong together somehow, you know. So I took out a chapter about the bird song, as uh, as kind of a catalyst. I even some of the images in the dissertation are of these birds in different variations of it. And so you know, it taught me a lot about listening, to answer your question, to listen when that when that kind of creative, and for me, it's not always like this big explosion. It's like a slow trickle. It's like a slow infusion. is to honor it, to honor wherever the creative flow is leading you, because I do believe that that's why I didn't like suffer through, and the dissertation wasn't hard, because I created enough space for it and I listened. And the actual first card in the deck is not necessarily an emotion. It is to listen. That's the first one in there. I thought about taking those two first cards out of the deck, or like, how could listening be an emotion? Like, I tried to like fixate on that a little bit, but really that was like the first message was to listen. And I feel like that skill, and sometimes I would have to, do certain practices where I was in silence, or I was like doing a practice where I would just listen to the work and not like, one of my chairs, after I did all this work and I handed in all this information, and they suggested, don't now basically he said, just throw that all out and just write and draw and share what is important to you without looking into any research, without quotes or without like looking at what other people say. And that was it was such a helpful doorway, because I had to listen. I had to really listen to myself and then express what it was that I wanted to share, what was important to me. And in with those questions, I don't remember exactly what the phrase was that he used, but it's like, what is important to you is actually what is going to be important to share. Just having any quote just because it's a young quote or a quote of some important person that already has, uh, hype, it might not be the vibration that needs to be heard, but what you feel is important, or what you've explored and experienced as tension, that's actually what is new and important. And that's what you want to care for. And I don't know if I'm giving justice to what he was saying. His name is Dylan Hoffman, and it was amazing to do that. And I remember telling somebody else in my cohort, oh yeah, like he told me just to like put everything, and it was like months. I mean, like at least 3 months that I just sat there and I drew and I wrote and I listened to that which I really wanted to tend to and to care for, and to put out into the world, to like share as a service.
I just want to say thank you. And I say this, I feel like this happens, and my listeners will probably be like, you sound like a broken record. But I feel like every time I talk to a guest on the podcast, it's always something that I'm working with or exploring. And so I appreciate you naming this idea of like sitting in and with the process and like listening, to let that lens, that voice, that perspective find its way to the top, right? So yeah, I'm just sitting over here scribbling down some notes because I'm like, oh, she talking to me.
Well, to my teacher's point, that's exactly what he meant. Sometimes, we resonate, something in us is resonating. And then when we see it in the world, it gives us a kind of like synchronistic moment. And then we pay more attention. So I don't think it's by accident that all the people that you have on your podcast, you're like, oh yeah, this is like resonant in my life right now. Yeah. I often think about the the decks that I've created and now this other kind of bigger work, which is like the dissertation, that it's almost like a time capsule of sorts. Because even when I talk about it, you know, people ask me about a lot of different things. I mean, it's a huge body of work. And sometimes in that moment, it's like, man, I'm having that feeling of like being with that, you know, image at that specific moment, and listening has been with me too lately. I go back to that a lot. And that the image is of like the shape is putting your ear literally to the ground and listening. Or, you know, if our bodies can't take on that shape, we use our imagination and we like imagine a big ear pointing down into the actual earth or wherever you want to point it. You know, it might be like pointing up into like towards the moon or towards a star or towards a place. But listening, and you know, you can listen with more than your ears, you can listen with your eyes and with your body. But it does become that, I want to use the word step towards creativity. You know, if we do take on that card as like, this is a gift and a first step, then maybe we will be uncomfortable when the guidebook doesn't tell you exactly. And then we'll listen. We'll listen. And maybe not the first time, maybe not the second time, but maybe the third time we might actually journal and make a little picture. Or we don't necessarily have to journal. We can just have a conversation, you know, with, I hope this deck takes on a life of its own of like where people are like hanging out and like, they're like, oh, let's play with this deck. And, you know, just pull a card and say like, oh, you know, let's explore this shape together and this word and have a conversation about it versus like, hi, how are you? What do you do for a living? You know?
Listen, I appreciate you naming that because what's interesting is I feel like your deck came at the right time, in a few different contexts, even particularly when I had a energy healing session with an intuitive. The idea came up that it's like you are good at intellectualizing your feelings,
Yeah.
but what would it look like to actually be in a space where you're actually feeling your feelings?
Yeah.
And when she said that, I was like, oh, okay, I get what you're saying. I feel it. And I feel like the practice that I've been able to cultivate since I've had the deck has really sort of helped me start to like feel the feelings and not like over intellectualize that. It's like, yes, I'm feeling angry. Great. I'm acknowledging it without really sitting and like, cool, you're feeling angry. Sit in that. It's cool. It's okay. It's safe. Right. So I want to say thank you for creating the deck because I feel like that intention is definitely coming through.
Yeah. Thanks for naming that. And you use the word sit in it, but you might need to move with it too.
True. 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 Very true. Very true. Which is I've been working on that too. Working on that too.
Oh.
So Chanti, where can folks get the Birdsong deck?
So you can get it at yantrawisdom.com. It's out for pre-order right now. And then I believe it's going to be summer solstice. It'll start to kind of make its way to people's doorsteps. So that's where you can get it now.
Awesome. Listen, Dr. Chanti, thank you so much for taking your time to converse with me today. It's always a beautiful conversation with you. I want to say thank you. Quite often when I'm in spaces where I'm naming my teachers, your name is always lifted up. So I just want to thank you for all the wisdom, all of the compassion, just all the beautiful energy that you shared with me since I've known you. And yeah, thank you for making time to chat.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for playing with the deck and for the questions. The questions they were lighting me up. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you so much. If you're listening to the podcast, check the podcast show notes. All the links to connect with Dr. Chanti will be in the show notes. If you're watching on YouTube, click down in the description. All that info will be there. Yeah. Thanks so much. This was wonderful as always.
Thanks, Sean.
Hey, Rebels, thank you for joining us on another episode of the Mindful Rebel podcast. Remember, after this listen, ask yourself where wisdom can meet practice and where compassion can meet action. Take a moment today to reflect on what resonated with you in this episode. Now, if you're feeling that rebel spirit, I'd invite you to like and share this episode. Your support helps spread the message of mindfulness, self-inquiry, and self-discovery. And if you're feeling extra generous, and I know you are, leave a rating and a review of the podcast. It helps others find this resource on their own mindfulness journey. May you move into the rest of your day with a greater sense of peace, clarity, and freedom.